Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome to the Stoa, everyone. Jason Snyder is back at the Stoa. Jason was here at the beginning when the Stoa first started. He was doing, mimetic mediation campfire every Sunday until he started getting practical with this regeneration stuff, and he left that behind. But in a WhatsApp voice message that he sent before the session, he said, and I quote, "You can take the man out of the mimetic mediation scene, but you cannot take the mimetic mediation out of the man." And I'm really excited for this session in particular, because if you read the event blurb, Jason indicated that he was going to address and sort of weave together movements that are not really talking to each other: localism, bioregionalism, decentralization movement, and metamodernism. And if anyone can do it, Jason is the man. So I'll be taking in Jason in a moment. He'll share his thoughts on the subject at hand for about 10 minutes, and then we'll pivot to the Q&A. We might have an open discussion after that as well. But if you have any questions anytime, put in the chat, calling you, unmute yourself, ask it to Jason. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Jason, my friend, welcome back to the Stoa. The Stoa is yours.
There we go. Thank you, Peter. Pleasure to be back. Let's see, sorry, someone messaged and it distracted me. So hello, everybody. Some familiar faces here, some new faces, so that's good. Yeah, so as Peter mentioned, both Peter and I wrote an article for the Side View on mimetic mediation, and I would say left the space, the sense-making space broadly, kind of intentionally. Part of it had to do with starting a homestead and getting busy and wanting to move, dirt around, and thinking that, all of this conversation is for losers. But I come back to my earlier selves. They all get integrated at some point. So that's what this is about. So, today I'm talking what I see as kind of a loosely held big change coalition. Four movements that I've identified, and I'll go through each of these, what I would call localism, localists, decentralists, bioregionalists, and metamodernists. I would say that they're all interested in big change. They all tend to think that the status quo is not viable in the long term for different reasons, which we'll get into. And they all point a need to transition to kind of a new systems state. But they're coming at it from different places, I would say. They're different kind of sociologically in a cultural sense. But there's a lot of overlap as well. If you were to plot, say, like Twitter diagrams of these movements, I would say you would have 4 different clusters, but they would have a lot of overlap, right? So today I want to talk about, what I think they have in common, where I think tension lies, and how that tension can be creative tension. I don't see them as all mushing together into one movement. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I think, in the spirit of mimetic mediation, I'm interested in opening kind of points of dialogue, because I've seen, especially recently, some kind of chest beating and turf demarking that I think is unhelpful. And so this is trying to take this in a different direction. All right, so I want to start a little bit with my history and how I've evolved through these scenes. So if you had caught me, say, on Twitter 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I'd be talking a lot about metamodernism. Like, I wouldn't shut up about it. I was really influenced by, for example, the Hansi books, the Listening Society, Nordic ideology. I started, started a podcast. We started bringing on people that were talking about decentralization, in terms of, say, currency, in terms of communication, manufacturing, energy, and that started becoming very interesting to me. And as I continued, I started, reading some of the literature from the bioregionalists. Joe Brewer was really influential for me. And his recent book, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, was really influential for me. And I would say in the last year, localism itself as a kind of memeplex has become very interesting to me. And I think that's partly overlapped with becoming a homesteader, or a baby homesteader. A long way to go, but the themes around localism itself became a lot more resonant to me. So that's where I kind of want to start. So localism, I would say it's more like neolocalism now, and I think neolocalism was popularized by folks like Taleb, and then other people like Joe Norman. But their critique is not so much left and right, but it's about scale. And they see that with what we have, with what you would call a neoliberal or neoconservative, or in a broader tent, globalist economic system, that it's very vulnerable to tail risk, and they're really interested in bringing back what we saw many times in the past of like village economies, of bringing back notions of community and multi-generational families, bringing back kind of a notion of resiliency at a community level, self-sufficiency, or quasi-self-sufficiency at a household level. You will find that a lot of localists tend to be kind of trads, you can say. Trad has kind of become a meme. So if you follow localist accounts, you'll get a lot of like cottagecore, things like that. And so a closely related movement to localism, I would say, is bioregionalism. But whereas I would say localists come from a little bit more from the trad end of the political spectrum, bioregionalists kind of come from more of the left. And so while localists might be kind of what you would call distributists, where they're interested in kind of, what Chesterton, advocated, that everyone gets 3 acres and a cow, where you want to distribute property ownership pretty broadly, but property ownership is important. A bioregionalist might be, more interested in like creating cooperatives in terms of ownership, or democratizing ownership, you could say. Bioregionalists tend to think more explicitly in terms of ecology and talk about ecological consciousness. Also, learning from kind of our indigenous past and decolonization. So all of these are part of the bioregionalist memeplex. Now, I would say, and I think this is where one thing where bioregionalists kind of misinterpret localists, is that localists don't talk explicitly about ecology so much, but if you've ever read like Wendell Berry, who is kind of like the resident hero of new localism, it's very much part of the philosophy. Both localists and bioregionalists tend to be interested in things like permaculture, but bioregionalists are more likely to talk about earth limits, ecological trauma, things like this, right? One aspect of localism, or one description of localism that I really like, is this notion that we should be thinking in terms of minimum viable scale, right? And one connection I see is that bioregionalism is bioregions themselves are a very important scale of analysis. If we're interested in sustainability and regeneration, designing human culture society around landscapes is very important, right? If you have kind of incoherent ownership structures, let's say at a watershed scale, and you don't have coherence, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be very sustainable. So bioregionalism itself, I think you can look at it both as a bioregion, which is kind of just that's a scale, that's the ecological boundary, maybe also a cultural boundary, but it's also kind of a sensibility, right? A sensibility of bringing ourselves back in line with flows, with the notion of like natural flows, right? So this includes things like seasonal eating, localizing food systems, and even, when we're thinking about energy, not mining fossil fuel stocks, but skimming on flows of, sunlight, of biomass, things like that. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to bring in the decentralists. So where I see decentralists playing a valuable role is they create the infrastructure to make 21st century localism or bioregionalism viable. In other words, unless you have the actual infrastructure, whether it be decentralized energy networks, decentralized manufacturing, what's also called cosmo-localism, and I'll get to that connection with localism in a moment, or whether it's kind of decentralized currencies or communication, all of this is technology that wasn't available in the past, right? So when I'm thinking of localism in particular, it's not our great-great-grandmother's localism, right? It's localism plus kind of the utilization of these new technologies that the decentralization movement is working on. Now I'll bring in this notion of cosmo-localism or cosmopolitan localism. So one part of something that I see as necessary for making either localism or bioregionalism viable is that you still need to have kind of a cosmopolitan element. You need to have a sharing of information, right? In cosmo-localism, you're sharing, you're developing open source technology, open source designs. That, like, an example is one organization, Open Source Ecology, that they're interested in creating open source designs, but localizing kind of things like manufacturing, localizing things like agriculture, many things. Of course, arguably you can't localize everything, and you would still need trade. You would still need communication across localities, across bioregions. And this is where, decentralization brings in kind of the infrastructure to do that, to help start creating a collective intelligence and collaboration across localities, across bioregions. Okay, so finally I'll hit on metamodernism. And I think, where the decentralization movement kind of brings in the physical infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily bring in the maturity or the consciousness cultivation that's needed to transition to what I would roughly refer to as a cosmopolitan localist or cosmopolitan bioregionalist type of society. We're going to need to foster collective intelligence, right? And you can't really do that if you don't think about human development, human maturity. If you're not taking into account cultural theory, like where are people coming from? How do you actually foster conversations and dialogues across people from very different worldviews in this transition towards a new system state that all of these movements are interested in? So, I see metamodernism, with their cultural theory. So they talk a lot about like these transitions from modernism to postmodernism, and now we need a metamodernism, which is kind of taking in the critiques of postmodernism, of modernism, but it's coming at it from a more constructive lens. It's like, okay, we've critiqued modernism, we understand many of its flaws, but we need to still be constructive. We need to move forward because time is running out, right? We're on the precipice of various trajectories, some of which involve, frankly, human extinction with climate change, for example, or ecological degradation. But we're also on the precipice of perhaps something very beautiful and wonderful. And I think that's where metamodernism comes in. They help provide some of the cultural theory, some of this analysis of stages, of the effective value meme, of giving you kind of the lens you need for effective mimetic mediation, which Peter and I have both written about in the past, and really providing kind of the cultural scaffolding, I would say, for a collective intelligence. My critique of metamodernism, at least the kind of prescriptive political version, you would say the Nordic or Hansi schools, I think that I think it's a little bit, they haven't really taken in the critiques of complexity of localism and bioregionalism in terms of that things need to evolve from kind of the grassroots. You need to allow for that. I tend to find it a little bit too technocratic and urbanist for my taste, I would say. And so I think what metamodernism is lacking is filled in by these other movements that I'm talking about. And so I see all of these movements as having a part to play in what we can call a big change coalition, but all of none of them are complete in and of themselves. And hence my interest in kind of facilitating a dialogue across these movements. Not that, again, everyone's necessarily going to like each other or consider themselves part of the same kind of sensibility or movement, but to get the conversation going and to share insight. So All right, so I guess that's all I have to start with. And I guess we can go into Q&A or whatever you want to do, Peter.
Cool. So start putting your questions in the chat. I'll warm up Jason with one question. We were talking before we let people in about, the woke, anti-woke battlefront of the culture war that, is involved in this kind of localism, bioregionalism, and pretty much kind of all the intellectual scenes like integral theory, rationality, new atheism. And so maybe you can touch on that a little bit, but also maybe a broader, to broaden the question a bit, is where do you think the kind of the difficult points of communication or the difficult themes that will be barriers to communication are with kind of unifying or just at least having these kind of movements in conversation? And then maybe to tag another question on that is, I like irritated Jason on Twitter. He's like, your irritated tweets. Like what aspect of this sort of getting this conversation to happen is irritating you?
Okay, so in terms of where I see some kind of tension or flashpoints, I mean, you mentioned woke, anti-woke. I tend not to be as concerned about that stuff as other people. People seem to be very passionate about kind of woke stuff and or identifying as a social justice warrior or anti-woke. I do, I see it as a failure of empathy. I guess that this whole kind of tension that you mentioned. I think we do need to come to terms with the fact that much of our civilization was built on colonialism, on slavery, and we have to restore ourselves, thinking of a body politic, and that includes coming to terms with frankly our privilege. Our positionality in the system. I think all of that is valid, but I think it has to happen in a kind of an environment of trust where what we see online is that we start seeing call out culture and we see cancel culture and accusations, and it just starts becoming it starts becoming very counterproductive very quickly. And so I can see also where the anti-woke folks are coming from, in that where some of the dialogue has gone, is not very helpful. It's just accusatory. People are just feel like they have to walk on eggshells. They can't say what they're really thinking. They can't really have a real kind of conversation with each other. And so and again, I would say bioregionalists are kind of woke-ish, right? Like you have some that are kind of anti-woke and some that are more woke, so to speak. And localists tend to be anti-woke. But again, I think that this is just kind of a failure of empathy and dialogue. And I'd hope to navigate those waters skillfully without being kind of watching the reactionary tendency within myself, and to if I'm having a conversation with somebody coming from one angle or the other, just trying to see where they're really coming from, trying to have a conversation and avoid kind of reactionary responses. What was the second part of your question, Peter?
That was very mediation-ish of you, by the way, that response. Oh, cool. Yeah, is any other kind of like flashpoints or hot areas that are not allowing this conversation to flourish? And the other thing was like, what irritates you personally about all this?
Yeah, well, before I get to that, I want to say one more thing about the woke, anti-woke stuff, is that I think metamodernists, this is another place where they can really provide value, is because they've taken in the critique, what we can roughly, call the postmodern critique of modernism. And so, they're very skillful in general, I think, of navigating these woke, anti-woke waters and being constructive and saying, okay, well, we understand the critique, but how can we move forward constructively? So that's also where metamodernists can play a role here. In terms of like flashpoints that kind of annoy me, so recently, and I won't name names here, but like, I've seen, like, for example, bioregionalists kind of chest pumping and being like, oh, localism is not, is just not, very convincing or effective movement, and they should really, like, localism is a poor man's bioregionalism. Stuff like that, which I just found very annoying, because localists tend to be, at least the ones I've interacted with, tend to be very open-minded towards bioregionalism, even if they're, maybe not so interested in kind of like, abandoning the notion of like property ownership wholesale right away or something like that. So that's annoyed me. I find decentralists, so this is kind of like people who are really interested in crypto and stuff, and I find that decentralization without kind of these other movements tend to be, like decentralization towards what? Like what are we decentralizing towards? Is it towards just more kind of atomization and alienation from each other, from the kind of the larger society? And so, decentralists on their own, if they're not kind of informed by these other movements, tend to annoy me as well. Yeah, I mean, I can talk about how each of these movements, can annoy me once in a while. I don't know how far down this rabbit hole you want me to go, Peter.
That should be maybe another session, just what annoys Jason Snyder.
Yeah.
All right, so I my Wi-Fi messed up, so I lost the questions because I had to bounce out of the Zoom room. But I think Nathan, you had some thoughts to share.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I think my interest and my question lies in more of like the physical space of all of these modes you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is like not distinctive for any mode of like localism or the other ones. But it's really about people living in semi-rural areas having more of an opportunity to kind of like research and adopt these modes. And then it seems like most people don't live in those areas, and so they seem kind of I guess you could say boxed in to the economy of what they're doing. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about adopting some like type of incentive structures to for people who are interested in that, to kind of explore that, because maybe the individual person, I could see that being a viable option, or like a collective, but families, it would seem like it would be a lot to uproot. I guess that's where my interest lies, is the like physical space.
Yeah, this is a big question. So to start off with, I would say that there is what you would call an urbanist localist movement, especially around kind of this notion of cosmo-local production, fab labs, things like that. You find this a lot in like European cities, Barcelona. I know it's big in Barcelona and Amsterdam, where they're talking about like the donut model of, localizing a lot of life, culturally, but also in terms of production. And so this is happening at an urban level as well. But, from my perspective, a big part of, the localization that we need to see is localizing agriculture. I don't find industrial agriculture to be sustainable at all. And I think we need to move towards regenerative agriculture, but also smaller scale, like localizing agriculture. So that does bring in kind of a rural component. So I don't see everybody need to move to rural areas, but I do see very high density cities as not necessarily being viable in the future, especially as we move away from fossil fuels, away from industrial agriculture. In terms of like how we can actually incentivize this stuff, like this is, something that I think about a lot. For young millennials, let's say, who, many of them are in debt, the idea of like moving out to a homestead or something just isn't really in their cards for the foreseeable future, right? It's just our generation seems to, not have nearly as many opportunities as say the boomer generation did in terms of kind of, pursuing these kind of ideals. And so I definitely think that we're going to need, for example, a combination of things, and I'm influenced both by kind of like, what I would call mutualists who say, hey, we need to like, we need to create land trusts. We need to like pool our resources, or maybe there's some benefactor, or maybe even the government will be part of this, where, we acquire, a bunch of land, and then we create like permaculture cooperatives, right? And so the cooperative movement in general, I think, has to play a huge role in this to just give people access, or just, if you want to grow a garden and you don't have access, like just to have access to land that you can do that, and in collaboration with others. Now, of course, if you live in a suburb, most people in suburbs have these big lawns that are just grass. Rip those things up, start planting food. In urban areas, you have things like community gardens, and so there are options as well for people, especially if they're interested in food production, can get involved with that. There's also, and then the other side, there's a mutualist, but then I'm also kind of influenced by what are called distributists. And I've mentioned this before, where it's not so much that we're going to cooperatize all of the land or kind of the resources, but we want to distribute ownership of things like land as broadly as possible, right? And the idea there is that, say you have a village and everybody owns a few acres, what will emerge from that is kind of like a village type of economy, right? And this village economy will not be a villages of the past. It would have to involve a lot of this decentralization infrastructure, perhaps including 3D printing of localized manufacturing, but with using kind of global commons designs. And I still, and so how do you, what is the policy conversation to, incentivize both of these? I think that's, I don't have the answers to that, but I think we do need to be having that. I mean, people have talked about we need a new Homestead Act, so that would be more of kind of like a government intervention. Land reform is pretty controversial, right? Because that's taking away, that's controversial for people who are very, very strong on property rights. I tend to think that this will kind of happen naturally through a series of shocks. So we've already seen with COVID that a lot of people are able to work remotely now, if you're privileged enough to do that. Some people, are not privileged to work remotely, but that frees you up to in terms of flexibility of where you live. I also think that large-scale industrial agriculture is just not going to be viable in the foreseeable future, and I think a lot of the large-scale farmers are going to go bankrupt. And then the question is, what happens to all that land? Well, it might get bought up by benefactors, turned into land trust. It could be, you and a bunch of your friends pull together, to start kind of bootstrap a little village with your friends. It might be the government kind of distributing land through kind of a Homestead Act. I think all of these need to be on the table and part of the conversation. But that to me is, probably the biggest bottleneck to kind of what the localists, the bioregionalists, decentralists are all envisioning, is just how do we provide access at a large scale to the resources we need to live these alternative lifestyles that we think are necessary.
All right. I'll take in Sarah. Sarah, you had a question.
Thank you. I had a question because you didn't mention the whole movement around, favoring pro-social behavior and building commons, like Elinor Ostrom, all the new modes of organization, all the work around the Mind and Life Institute and economics. So I wonder what you thought about it, and how it, if it's because I'm in Europe, so maybe it's more important there. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah. Well, so this is, I think what I would call bioregionalists, what they bring to the table is, they talk a lot about the commons, right? And, I'm a big fan of Elinor Ostrom in the commons. And so there's a commons in terms of natural resource management. And we've seen, several examples throughout history where commons naturally evolve, and they're somewhat quasi-independent from the state or from private corporations, and they do a very good job, right? They set a number of protocols to manage the resource, and then the notion of the commons has been broadened, by people like Michel Bauwens and others, that they're talking about the commons are actually an alternative mode of economic organization, right? And so it's beyond just kind of natural resource management to open source and cosmo-local production, where again we have this kind of global collective intelligence of with regards to how do you build the machinery that you need? How do you build a DIY tractor, something like that? Using more locally sourced materials, but the designs, the intelligence to be able to do that is part of the commons as well. I would also say that I think any, even from kind of a localist perspective, and, localists talk a lot about like village economies, homesteads, even from that perspective, the role of the commons is really important, and, was a bigger part of our life in the past, where, neighbors, so for example, where I'm living now in Southern Appalachia, it was, you could say, kind of like a localist kind of situation where you had a bunch of homesteaders, but you also had, a strong culture of mutual aid. And I'm sure that some notion of the commons also existed where, perhaps my livestock would go and graze your land, when you weren't using it to grow other stuff. And there was kind of this emergent commons occurring anyway, even though it wasn't necessarily called that. So I'm just a big fan of, of everything that's happening in the scene. And I think, I hope it continues to kind of infiltrate the culture and change our thinking about, about economic organization as well as natural resource management.
Good. Okay. Let's take in Chris D.
Hey, Jason. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah.
How are you making sense of the different parts of the regenerative movement, especially in academia, with things like degrowth, Green New Deal, circular economy? Do you see academia getting closer to coherence? And what do you see are the main challenges of academia to have a coherent regenerative vision? Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm following these things. My department that I teach in is very much in line with these principles, I would say, of degrowth, of resilience, of sustainability. A lot of what I talk about in my classes, has to do with, teaching about, the donut model, teaching about what is degrowth, what does that mean? Teaching about like local food systems, regenerative agriculture, all of these things. I would say, localists, kind of self-described localists, don't necessarily think in terms of degrowth, but they live degrowth. Like that's like they literally, the lifestyles that they're pursuing are degrowth lifestyles, right? And so even though it's not an explicit kind of academic, paradigm that they hold, it's implicit in their lifestyles or the lifestyles that they're approaching. In terms of like the larger academic scene, I think there's a lot of great stuff going on, right? Like you have, you mentioned degrowth, you have people like Jason Hickel, who, is pretty popular and has a big audience, and he's, making good arguments in favor of it. You have people like, agroecologists, for example, in kind of an academic sense. So like I would say agroecology is kind of like the academic version of permaculture. I would say the permaculture is more of the applied, just like people, for me, permaculture is more of a grassroots kind of people just kind of trying things, learning. Of course, permaculture rests on a foundation of indigenous agriculture and traditional agriculture, and but also just kind of trying things, sharing it online. Whereas agroecology is kind of an academic movement where they're actually studying, using the scientific, method of like how various combinations of, of crops do well together and stuff. And so I see a lot of potential for emerging of these two movements. In this case, kind of a ground up grassroots movement, which I would see, I think you see a lot in localism and some in bioregionalism, and the decentralization movement, and in the academic sphere of people talking about this. I think there are cultural differences in preventing dialogue, right? Some of it might have to do with kind of the woke, anti-woke thing that we talked about before. So the academic side of this tends to be more on the quote unquote woke side, right? And if, because people are very kind of reactive about this kind of discussion, I think it prevents a lot of the more, the dialogue between the grassroots and the academic.
Good, Chris. Okay. Someone else had a question above. Carl, you still here?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, let me just scroll up and get it. How do you see the majority of people kind of overcoming and integrating and moving past the cultural baggage that I think across the world, and whether you're rural or you are urban, there
Mhm.
is kind of the prior era's modes of transaction, without, like within and without these decentralized ecologies that we're looking forward to. I see a lot of what you're talking about has shades of like E.F. Schumacher kind of like meets donut economy kind of stuff, which is really
Mhm.
beautiful. But I have a bit of an insight in, uh, connections with some people in the crypto scene, and there's a lot of people falling into the same pitfalls of the degenerative kind of like 20th century financial dynamics. So,
Yeah.
do you have thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's why I think that the decentralization movement is incomplete on its own, right? Because for me, again, the question is always decentralization into what? Into kind of new forms of accumulation, or new, on the anarcho-capitalist side, what are we going to have, like neo-feudalism? Like, to me, that's where it naturally leads to. And so, I think this kind of elevation of consciousness, people don't like to talk about that because it sounds too pie in the sky. But I think the bioregionalists have a lot of insight here because for them, they would say we need a paradigm shift towards a more ecological mode of being, right? A more ecological consciousness, as well as a more indigenous consciousness, as well as and coupled with that is the decolonization, right? Decolonization of our minds and our psychologies. And I also think metamodernists have a lot to add here as well, because metamodernists, one of the core metamodernist arguments is you can't really have societal evolution without the evolution of individuals as well, right? And personal development. And so they're really interested in like stage maps and, again, valuing people's effective value memes and designing institutions to help, I guess, people in their own personal growth and development, right? And so that's, so I see both the bioregionalists from one angle and metamodernists from another angle, both kind of addressing, this side of it, of like, how are we going to just, are we going to transition to a new system and the new system will just reproduce all of the same patterns of our old system? And, that won't, that's not good, right? And so we do need paradigm shifts. And I see those two movements being very interested in that and having conversations around that.
Any follow-up, Carl?
Yeah, I guess my follow-up would be, uh, it's sort of definitely the whole shift in consciousness and the paradigm shift of decolonization, especially what you mentioned about the whole world being under a shadow of colonialism, is something that, it's like a specter that haunts us all, especially when we're moving forward into these new ecologies. So it's very refreshing to hear that the decentralists do have some sort of, and I guess the bioregionalists are trying to move for that. But when you talk about building in these self-development models into the ecologies from the ground up, is there anything you can speak onto that side? Or is that just something we're hoping that as this develops and conversation moves on,
Yeah.
that we will kind of explore that kind of territory?
Yeah, well, I mean, so one, I don't think it should be top down. Like, I don't think the government should be like giving us our official development. This is, because people are going to reject that, right? The decentralists are going to reject that. The localists are going to reject that. And so, I do think, well, I think it'll be cosmo-local as well, in the sense that there is kind of this larger conversation, right? Like, we're all coming from different places, perhaps different parts of the world, and we're having a conversation. So this is part of like the collective intelligence space, but how it actually gets applied and evolved and adapted in any given context is going to be different, right? So I can see, and I haven't mentioned Game B here, but Game B talks a lot about kind of creating, experimenting with kind of village economies or modes of living, and explicitly incorporating kind of the psychotechnologies, into that. So this is, I know on the Stoa, the Stoa talks a lot about psychotechnologies and ecologies of practice and things like that. And I think all of that is great. I just don't think there's going to be one ecology of practice. That's actually a contradiction in terms, right? There's going to be, but so there is kind of a cohesive element that's kind of tying all these different experiments in living together, but they're all kind of still kind of developing and evolving on their own terms, according to their locality and a sense of place, right? So localism talks a lot about a sense of place and being connected to kind of the traditions of your place, and bioregionalists talk a lot about also the sense of place, especially ecologically, and being sensitive to what is kind of the ecological biological basis of your livelihood, and is it in balance, or are you externalizing a lot of the costs of your lifestyle or not? So yeah, I don't know if that helps answer your question. I mean, it's long-winded saying I don't know exactly, but a lot of people are thinking about and working on it, so that's hopeful.
No, thank you so much. It was a really good kind of like exploration to that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and one more thing, I saw someone mention in the chat, like the new kind of metamodern monasteries, right? Like Maple and others, and I think those have a lot to play as well, right? Because they're explicitly tying, kind of spiritual growth and development with kind of like co-living and different, interpersonal modalities and trainings and things like that. And God bless them. I think all of that is great, and they'll provide a lot of value in the future.
All right. I think it was Ryan. You had a question about Bill Gates, who's coming to the store next week.
I've got some things to say to him.
yeah. Jason's gonna be on there hosting Bill Gates. I guess speaking of colonialism and colonization, seems like we've got like a lot of power in this individual private money. And I remember reading an article recently where Bill Gates is now the largest private landowner with like, I don't know, some 250 million acres or some crazy shit.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm wondering where that fits in with these different eco-mimetic tribes, and how new colonization of land grabs is really going to look.
Yeah, this is a tough question. Well, so people have speculated on what Bill Gates is trying to do, right? There's people on the very conspiratorial end of those speculations, for sure. I personally, I don't know. I know that Bill Gates, I would call him an eco-modernist. He advocates for, GMOs, genetic modification of crops, probably everyone moving to a vegan diet. The conspiratorial minded would say that he's buying up all that land basically to take control of the food supply, for his vision of how we address climate change or something like that. I think that these new kind of land grabs, it obviously is problematic. I think Bill Gates is attached to an industrial model of, say, agriculture. And I just don't, for a variety of reasons, ecologically, but also energetically, I don't know how viable that's going to be in the future. I know Bill Gates is skeptical of like regenerative agriculture in terms of like carbon sequestration, and he thinks that, that's, at least accounting for carbon sequestration, creating like carbon markets. He might have a point there in terms of like, it is very difficult to quantify, how much carbon planting a tree is going to sequester, considering that the tree might be burned down in a few years or something. I'm kind of a doomer. I tend to think that collapse is just kind of going to happen, not immediately, but over the next few decades. And as that collapse happens, it's going to open up, new potentials for transitioning to, you know, alternative system state. You know, and I would hope that some of these kind of big money folks who are buying up land might eventually be convinced to, say, you know, create a land trust. You know, if they're convinced of kind of a, say, a permacultural vision, they could create a land trust, and, you know, where you could have kind of cooperative structures, things like that. That would be my appeal to them, but they're probably not going to listen to me, and the future is going to be wild. That's all I got to say.
Any follow-up, Ryan?
Yeah, well, maybe when Bill Gates comes onto the Stoa, you can advocate for your vision. I'm wondering, basically in that same vein, what you think of like techno-utopia, or like if you're familiar with like the Diamandis trilogy, he starts advocating for like all sorts of like techno-utopian ideas, especially in terms of agriculture, you know, and also like protein sources that are simple and that can be autonomous and self-sovereign. Like I've been looking at insect protein a bunch lately.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I've fought with techno-utopians in the past, or, you know, and that might not be a fair term, as people have pointed out to me. Maybe a techno-optimist is a fair term. You know, I'm a fan of appropriate technology that helps us live within the limits of the earth, to live well within the limits of the earth, right? And so, you know, a lot of this kind of decentralization technology, especially with regards to energy, you know, I think we're going to need renewable energy. You know, that's high tech. You know, we're going to need alternative currencies. That's high tech. So I'm in favor of technology that helps us basically with the degrowth project of living well, while, you know, reducing the throughput of material extraction from the Earth's crust, as well as, you know, our emissions and destruction of, you know, ecologies and landscapes, things like that. You know, I think I tend to be quite skeptical of like the hyper techno-optimist of, you know, I've had conversations with people that basically, you know, if you mention ecology, they just kind of look at you like you're some like pathetic little dog or something, right? Like, oh, ecology, whatever. Like we can just put that information on a chip and regenerate ecologies easily, you know, and you know, and they seem to be more interested in going to Mars than to actually regenerating the Earth. You know, I have big problems with that, because I just think that they're delusional. And I'm also more skeptical than them about our energy future. You know, if you look at graphs, renewable is growing, but fossil fuels have also been growing, right? Our demand for energy globally just keeps going up, and fossil fuel consumption keeps going up, and fossil fuels are going to continue to get more and more expensive to extract. And I'm just skeptical that we're going to be able to maintain the same complexity of our civilization and lifestyle, you know, even with renewable energy technology. So, you know, I would advocate appropriate technology with degrowth, which implies, you know, less waste, less consumption, while still maintaining a nice lifestyle, equity, things like that.
All right. So our last question will go to Ola. Ola, if you can ask your question.
Jason, thank you for... Okay.
Ola, your mic's actually pretty bad.
Hear me now?
No.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I'll read your question. If you asked me originally to read it, and I pressured him privately in the chats for him to read it. So let's just go up to it. Okay, as I can see it, Bill Gates and actors like Monsanto are keen to bring unsustainable, highly chemical farming to Africa. I think this would only create a spiral in which the countries become even more dependent on corporations with questionable ethics and serious negative health impacts over time. Ideas on how to escape this problem?
Yeah, so I'm quite familiar with this trend because my background is is in applied economics, and I did a lot of work in Africa, or a lot of research in Africa, and from what I can tell, everyone, government agencies, Bill Gates Foundation, seem to have bought into this notion of structural transformation, which is basically speeding, global South along the trajectory that the West has gone on. Part of that includes getting farmers to adopt technology. What that means in practice is chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, larger scale tractors, larger scale agriculture in general. I just think, one, in the long term, I think we're setting people up for failure because you're making people dependent on global markets and kind of the uncertainty of global markets. Whereas before people were definitely not rich by any standard, but were more self-sufficient as a community, and by making people more dependent on markets, global markets, I think that's less resilient. I certainly think that chemical agriculture is not sustainable. There seems to be a huge blind spot in the development, development economics literature around this. Like, they kind of treat climate change and as like one category, and then it's compartmentalized, and then sustainability is something else. But actually, it's all tied together. So there is a lot of efforts to get like rural farmers in places like Africa to basically get out of agriculture, right? Part of structural transformation is to increase the scale, get people out of agriculture. Where are they going to go? Well, a lot of them are going to go to the cities. We already have very quick, rapid urbanization, and that leads into my critique about urbanization in general, and how I don't think we're going to continue to urbanize at the same rates. I think we're going to have to de-urbanize at some point. So yeah, I have issues with what he's trying to do there, and what many development organizations are trying to do.
All right. Ola, do you think your mic is working for a follow-up, or?
Well, one more thing I would add there, but I also think that there's an opportunity for many places that are historically colonized, poor, et cetera, to leapfrog. We've already seen in Africa a leapfrog of like cellular technology, right? Like, there's no landlines, or very few landlines in Africa. They leapfrog to cellular technology, and there's a lot of innovation happening there. And I also think this vision of kind of decentralized manufacturing, energy, all of this stuff can also just be adopted straight up without having to, for example, urbanize or to move towards massive monocropping agriculture. And what can make that viable are these decentralized technologies. And so it'll be leapfrogging like two or three industrial revolutions. And there, some of you might have heard of Jeremy Rifkin, third industrial revolution. So there's the first industrial revolution with coal, second one with oil, and the third one he sees as more distributed. And I see, many places jumping straight, from pre-first industrial revolution to all the way to the third.
Can I try to? Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, you're good now, Ola.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is going to be more like a statement that could lead to a question.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because a lot of parts in Africa, of countries in Africa, are moving into what I'll call capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A lot of them are just borrowing ideas from America and using those models to make money. But coming into these spaces, I can see how it can be problematic in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So things like metamodernism or homestead or neoliberalism isn't even a thing here yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So my question would be, so I'm trying to understand how to navigate the impending doom because it's not happening right now, but I think it's going to start becoming a problem very soon. So what are your ideas on how to effectively distribute these ideas? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's, through events like this, just by, spreading ideas, and people are going to interpret and process them, however they see fit. I think, being a Westerner, being from the United States, I can't, it's not my place to talk about how, for example, countries in Africa should develop, right? I think that, it's up to them to determine, what trajectory, which direction that they want to go, right? And which direction they want to move. Again, I think somebody mentioned in the chat that crypto is becoming big in Africa. We already see kind of a lot of innovation occurring through like cell phone technology and things like payments and giving information to farmers about the weather and things like that. And so, the technologies, I think, might just start infiltrating and becoming available for, whatever scale you're thinking about, whether it's a country scale or it's a village scale of, communities determining how they want to develop or in which direction they want to move in, right? And I would think that adopting kind of this cosmo-local kind of vision would be a good path to go. But again, I don't want to determine. I think every context, every place is gonna come up with their own path of systems change. And every community, because they're adapting to their own context and innovating in their own context, are going to have a lot to share to the global community in how other parts of the world might also want to approach development. So I don't know if I answered your question well or not, but that's all I got.
Yes. Cosmo local sound like global. Yeah, that sounds like something that makes sense to me. Thank you.
It sounds like what? You cut out a little bit.
So it sounds like a thing that makes a lot of sense to me.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. We'll close out here. We're at the top of the hour. That was a fun session. So good to have Jason Snyder back at the Stoa. Jason, my friend, any closing thoughts? Anything came alive for you that you'd like to share and leave us with?
No, I thought this was a great conversation, great questions. I would just say, if you resonate with any of these movements, or even kind of, the attempted mimetic mediation of these movements, let's continue the conversation. Let's find areas of common ground where we can at least collaborate together to, change the trajectory of our systems towards a more resilient, sustainable state. And so let's keep the conversation going. Reach out to me if you want to talk more about any of these topics. And thank you very much for your attention and time.
Amen, brother. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Jason, thank you so much for coming to Stoa. Love to have you back. To plug upcoming events, the one we're having at 2 p.m. Eastern time is canceled. The one on quantified self, Gary Wolf, is a COVID vaccine shot or something like that. So you can't make it. But then at 10 p.m. Eastern time, we have Terra Sapien, the network human Borg, Reese Linkmark, a little different than what we talked about today, but I imagine there's some parallels. You can RSVP there. Bill Gates is coming in next week before the Great Reset we're having on the March 21st. So be sure to check that out. And yeah, everyone, thanks for coming to Stoa today.